We begin my top 36 remaining wide receiver rankings with wide receivers that I think are probably mid to low end wide receiver threes. Remember that wide receivers who played on Thursday night, such as any Chargers or Broncos wide receivers, are not included. We have Jerry Jeudy, Calvin Ridley, MHJ, Jalen Coker, Xavier Worthy, and Romeo Dobbs. All right, so let's talk about Jerry Jeudy. The last time DTR started, and as we all know, Jameis Winston isn't playing this week, he went 1 for 18 on 6 targets against Cincinnati. I do think he's going to have a better game than he did in week 7, but I think that his floor and ceiling have been tremendously decreased with DTR. And so I think he's a fine flex play wide receiver 3 type this week, but I really think the upside has basically been erased. And now we have Calvin Ridley. So the last time he played Indianapolis, he was blanked and he had 8 targets. I don't think he's going to have that much of an issue, especially because Will Levis has been replaced with Mason Rudolph once again, and Calvin Ridley looked better with Mason Rudolph. And so I still think that he's a low-end wide receiver 3, but I do think he's going to perform better this time than he did the past time in which he faced Indianapolis. And now we have Marvin Harrison Jr. against Carolina. All right, so Marvin Harrison Jr. has been quite disappointing for us in fantasy. I did a video this about 2 weeks ago where I detailed out why this has been the case. He still looks really good on film. Unfortunately, in the vertical X role in which he's being asked to run, he's not being given targets that are easy to grab. Kyler Murray hasn't been fantastic either, and so it's really hindered his upside and made his floor quite low. I do think he's going to have a decent wide receiver 3 week here against Carolina, but I really would limit expectations because until we see better usage from him, or at least the connection between him and Kyler grow, it's really tough to trust him as more than a volatile wide receiver 3, but he does have upside from week to week. And with Jalen Coker, Xavier Legette is going to miss this game, and so I do think that's going to raise the floor and ceiling of Jalen Coker. I don't think he's going to have a fantastic day here against Arizona. They do allow the 11th fewest points to fantasy wide receivers, but I do think he's going to be a solid wide receiver 3. Xavier Worthy did have a rushing touchdown this past week. Here against Houston, it is an advantageous matchup. I do think he has a receiving touchdown in this game, but I think otherwise his total yardage and his receptions are going to be limited. And finally, we have Romeo Dobbs. Against New Orleans, it's an absolutely fantastic matchup. I do think he ends up with a receiving touchdown, and I think he's going to be a solid mid-wide receiver 3 for us. And now we have wide receivers that I think are mid-wide receiver 3s to potentially low-end wide receiver 2s. We have Downs, Mooney, Thielen, Smith, Flowers, Allen, Addison, and Metcalf. So Josh Downs, the last time in which he played Tennessee, he had 7 for 66 and 1 touchdown on 9 targets. Here against Tennessee, they do allow the 6 fewest points to fantasy wide receivers, but I think he's going to be the safety blanket for A-Rich in this game. And so I think in a full PPR setting, he's going to be a solid wide receiver 3. And now we have Darnell Mooney against the Giants. All right, so he had 1 target and no receptions this past week, so it crushed us in fantasy. It was quite disappointing. The good news, though, if you were able to somehow achieve a win last week, is that now we have Michael Penix starting. He is going to open up the deep part of the field. We're going to see more vertical shots. We're going to see the entirety of the field open up. It's going to improve the efficiency of the offense, and defenses are going to have to respect the Falcons' pass catchers again. And so I think that Darnell Mooney this week is going to be a solid wide receiver 3 with a lot of upside. And now we have Adam Thielen against Arizona. So in each of the past 3 games, he's had at least 7 targets and 10 full PPR fantasy points. Here against Arizona, they do allow the 11th fewest points to fantasy wide receivers, but I still think he's going to get it done for us as a wide receiver 3, and he's going to have a really safe floor. Devontae Smith went off this past week, and he's also had 2 touchdowns in the past 2 games. Here against Washington, they do allow the 14th fewest points to wide receivers. I do think that A.J. Brown is going to have a much better game than him, but I still think he's going to be a fine wide receiver 3 for us, but I don't think he scores a touchdown. Zay Flowers went 2 for 39 with a touchdown on 6 targets the last time in which he played Pittsburgh. They do allow the 12th fewest points to fantasy wide receivers. I think he's going to get it done in terms of a full... Zay Flowers went 2 for 39 with a touchdown on 6 targets the last time in which they played Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh historically gives fits to Lamar Jackson, basically for the entirety of his career. And so I do think it's going to be a little bit of a rough game for Zay Flowers in terms of the maximum upside that he has from week to week. I still think he's going to get it done in a full PPR setting, but I don't think he scores a touchdown. Keenan Allen has 20 full PPR points in 3 of the past 4 weeks. Here against Detroit, he went off against them the last time in which they played. I don't think he's going to have as much of a massive game this week against them, but I do think he ends up scoring a touchdown. Jordan Addison, in 2 of the past 4 weeks, has had a massive game for us. He's also had fewer than 10 fantasy points in 1, and this past week he had 13. Here against Seattle, I do think it's a good matchup for him. I think he ends up scoring a touchdown, but I don't think he has a massive day overall. DK Metcalf has been quite disappointing for us since week 7. Here against Minnesota, this is absolutely a matchup that he can exploit. I don't think he ends up with a touchdown, but I think he gives us a solid low-end wide receiver 2 fantasy day. If you like what you're hearing and seeing so far, feel free to like and subscribe. It's a free and easy way to support the channel, and I'd really appreciate it. Make sure you check out my running back, tight end, and quarterback rankings as well, and I hope you smash your playoff matchups. And now we have wide receivers that I think are low-end wide receiver 2s to potentially high-end wide receiver 2s. We have Juwan Jennings, Terry McLaurin, Tyreek Hill, Cooper Kupp, Khalil Shakir, Jacoby Myers, Garrett Wilson, Malik Neighbors, DJ Moore, and Drake London. Juwan Jennings has had at least 20 full PPR points in 2 of the past 6 weeks, including another game with at least 15, but he's also had 3 games of sub 10. Here against Miami, it is a difficult matchup. They do allow the 3rd fewest points to fantasy wide receivers, but I do think he's going to be the wide receiver to step up. I still think he's a low-end wide receiver 2, but I do think he ends up scoring a touchdown. Terry McLaurin, the last time in which he played Philadelphia, was held to 1 reception for 10 yards on 2 targets. Here against Philly this time, I think he's going to have a better day. I think he's going to have a limited day from a yardage perspective, but I do think he ends up scoring a touchdown. Tyreek Hill is playing against San Fran. Now, he is questionable with a wrist injury and then personal reasons. I do think he ends up playing in this game, and with Jalen Waddle not playing, I do think that's going to give him an extended opportunity of looks. I still think he's going to be a solid wide receiver 2, but I don't think he has one of these massive weeks in what is a really tough matchup. Cooper Kupp went 0 for 0 and 0 on 3 targets this past week. It was absolutely soul-crushing for us in the first week of the fantasy playoffs. Here against the Jets, it is a difficult matchup. They do allow the 5th fewest points to fantasy wide receivers. I definitely think he's going to get back on track. I still think he's a mid-wide receiver 2, but I do think he ends up scoring a touchdown. Khalil Shakir has seen at least 7 targets in every week since week 7, and he has 2 touchdowns in the past 2 games. Here against New England, it is an advantageous matchup. I think he's going to be a solid wide receiver 2 for us, but I don't think he's going to have one of these massive blow-up days. Jacoby Myers has scored at least 10 full PPR points in each of the past 4 weeks. He gets Aiden O'Connell back. That's much better than Desmond Ridder. Plus, he gets a matchup with the Jacksonville Jaguars, who allow the 3rd most points to fantasy wide receivers. I think he's a solid mid-wide receiver 2 for us, and I think his floor is one of the safest in the NFL. Garrett Wilson is coming off a game in which he was limited in terms of his output in terms of receptions and yards, but he did happen to score a touchdown against Jacksonville. The Rams are an advantageous matchup. It should be a game script in which necessitates quite a bit of passing. I think he's a solid wide receiver 2, but I do think that Davante Adams is the preferred play out of the 2 wide receivers this week. Malik Neighbors has scored double-digit fantasy points in every week since week 8. He has one of the highest target totals in the NFL. He is as safe as it gets in terms of the floor, but the ceiling hasn't been tremendous. He did score a touchdown this past week and finished as a top 10 wide receiver. It was his first touchdown since week 3. Here against the Atlanta Falcons, it's absolutely a matchup he can exploit. I think he's a high-end wide receiver 2, but I don't think he has one of these massive weeks. DJ Moore has scored at least 10 full PPR points in each of the past 5 weeks, and he did put up over 25 the last time in which he played Detroit. I think he's in for a massive target volume day again. I don't think he's going to have as big of a day as he did the past time in which he played Detroit, but I do think he ends up scoring a touchdown. Drake London, just like with Darnell Mooney, is getting a huge boost at the quarterback position. If Penix had been starting for a lot longer, I think we might have seen a lot more production from Drake London. It's hard to say. It is Penix's first day, but I do think he ends up throwing a touchdown to Drake London, and I think London is a high-end wide receiver 2. And now we have wide receivers that I think are mid to low-end wide receiver 1s, but I don't think are likely candidates to be the wide receiver 1. We have A.J. Brown, T. Higgins, Devontae Adams, ASRB, and Nico Collins. A.J. Brown had been in a little bit of a slump before this past week. He had a massive week this past week. Here against Washington, he had a fine PPR week with a little bit over 10 points last time in which he played Washington. I do think he's going to have a better day than he did the past time this week. I do think he ends up scoring a touchdown, and I do think he's a low-end wide receiver 1. T. Higgins has been very hot and cold. It basically alternates every other week. Here against Cleveland, though, I do think this is a matchup he can exploit. I think he and Chase and Burrow are going to have a massive week altogether. And so I do think he's going to end up scoring a touchdown, and I do think he's a top 12 option. Devontae Adams has been on an absolute tear, posting over 25 and 40 fantasy points in the past 2 weeks. Here against the Rams, it's absolutely a matchup he can exploit. The game script should necessitate quite a bit of passing. I do think he's a top 10 option, and I do think he ends up scoring a touchdown. ASRB is coming off a monster performance this past week. However, the last time in which he played against Chicago, he had a little bit north of 13 fantasy points. I do think with Detroit's defense hurting, that they are going to have to score more points overall as an offense. And so I do think that's going to lead to increased volume for him, and specifically scheme touches. And so I do think he's going to be a top 10 option, but I don't think he's going to have a ridiculous performance against what's a really difficult opponent in the Bears. Nico Collins is playing against the Kansas City Chiefs this week. It is a difficult matchup, and they do allow the 13th fewest points to wide receivers. However, Nico Collins has had at least 17 full PPR points in each of the past 3 weeks. I don't think that changes here against Kansas City, in what should be a relatively fun game to watch, and I think they will see a lot of passing volume. And now we have mid to elite wide receiver ones that I think are realistic candidates to be the wide receiver one. We have BTJ, Puka, Lamb, JSN, Evans, Jefferson, and Chase. BTJ, since the bye 3 weeks ago, or really 4 weeks ago, he's seen 10, 12, and then 14 targets this past week. We have seen his usage massively increase, even in a tough matchup here against the Las Vegas Raiders, who allowed the 8th fewest points to wide receivers. I think he's going to see a good amount of volume, and I do think he scores a touchdown. Puka Nacua, since his return from a knee injury, has been marvelous. I don't think any of that changes this week, even in a difficult matchup against the Jets, who allow the 5th fewest points to wide receivers. I think he's a top 10 option, and I do think he scores a touchdown. And now we have CeeDee Lamb. While at first, in the absence of Dak Prescott, I was pretty worried about CeeDee. Yeah, he's still really good, and it apparently doesn't even matter. So I think in an advantageous matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, he's going to see a lot of volume. I don't think he scores a touchdown, but I think he has a massive day from a full PPR perspective. We have JSN now. After basically being the third fiddle and the forgotten man for the entirety of his rookie season, and then having one massive game in week 2 earlier, all of a sudden, in the absence of DK Metcalf a couple weeks ago, they decided, well, geez, let's try targeting our really good first-round pick. And as you probably could imagine, that turned out to be a good idea. And so here we are. He is consistently putting over 15 full PPR points up every week. I don't think that changes here against Minnesota, who do allow the most fantasy points to wide receivers. I think he has a fantastic day, and I do think he scores a touchdown. Mike Evans is coming off a ludicrous game with over 35 full PPR points. I don't think he does that again, but I think they're going to try really hard to get him to 1,000 yards. I think he has over 100 receiving yards in this game, and he's a top 3 option. Justin Jefferson is getting hot at the perfect time for us fantasy owners. He did drop what could have been another touchdown this past week, so he could have had 4 in the past 2 weeks. He looks fantastic. He's getting back on track. Here against Seattle, it's absolutely a matchup he can exploit, and I think he's a top 2 option. And finally, we have Jamar Chase. Like I've said for a couple weeks now, he's as good of a bet to have 40 points as he is 20. I don't think he has a 40-point game, but I don't think Cleveland's going to be able to do anything to stop this offense. I think Jamar Chase will be the wide receiver 1, and I do think he has over 100 receiving yards with a touchdown. And so to review, wide receivers that I think are mid to low-end wide receiver 3s, we have Judy, Ridley, MHJ, Coker, Worthy, and Dobbs. Wide receivers that I think are mid wide receiver 3s to potentially low-end wide receiver 2s, we have Downs, Mooney, Thielen, Smith, Flowers, Allen, Addison, and Metcalf. Wide receivers that I think are probably low-end wide receiver 2s to high-end wide receiver 2s, we have Jennings, McLaurin, Hill, Kupp, Shakir, Myers, Wilson, Neighbors, Moore, and London. Wide receivers that I think are mid to low-end wide receiver 1s, but aren't likely candidates to be the wide receiver 1. We have Brown, Higgins, Adams, St. Brown, and Collins. And then wide receivers that I think are mid to elite wide receiver 1s with a realistic shot at being the wide receiver 1 this week. We have BTJ, Nacua, Lamb, JSN, Evans, J. Jettis, and Chase. All right, you know the drill. Who do I have too high? Who do I have too low? Is there somebody that I'm not projecting for enough points? If so, let me know below in the comment section and let me know why. Make sure you check out my other positional rankings, such as my running backs, tight ends, and quarterback rankings. And I hope each and every single one of you smashes your fantasy playoff matchups this week.